Hello, and welcome back to episode 6 of You Are Not Your Diagnosis. Today's topic is all about your genes are not your destiny. I want to start today's episode with a question. What percentage of all illness do you think is caused by genetics? Don't overthink it, just say what percent comes to mind. So, recent research in probably the past 20 to 30 years has indicated that only about 3 to 5% of all illness is caused by genes. The rest, what is that caused by? Well, stay tuned for today's episode because we're going to be diving deep into this topic and into the field of epigenetics. And don't worry, if you don't know what that means, I'm going to explain it in a simple way. So the old paradigm that we used to believe in science and in terms of our health was that illness ran in families. So if you had a history of cancer in your family, that was kind of maybe a predestination that you were likely to get cancer, or that was the case with many different illnesses. And so we thought that kind of our genes were our destiny, and whatever we inherited from our family meant that we were more likely to get that. But this cool new research into the field of epigenetics shows that that's not really true. That only 3 to 5% of all illness is caused by our genes. And I have friends and colleagues that think it may even be smaller than that, like 1 to 2%. So let's dive into what actually causes illness for the vast majority of us. And what does this field of epigenetics mean? So I like to explain epigenetics in terms of an analogy that makes it simple for you to understand, because we all know that science can be kind of big and heavy. And so we're going to be talking about how our genes work like a recipe in a cookbook. So we can all be familiar with that and have an understanding of what that means. So what epigenetics refers to is there are different markers that sit on top of genes, and they turn genes on and off. So if you think about it, every cell in your body has the same 23 chromosomes in it and the same strands of DNA and all of that information. But each cell in the body doesn't need the same information. So for example, your muscle cells don't need the information on how to do functions if they were bone or if they were an organ like your heart. They only need to know the information to do with just your muscles. So how do they know then, out of these 23 chromosomes with tons and tons of information, what information they need? So this is where the analogy of, we're going to dive into that idea of the recipe book, the cookbook. So if you think of basically the 23 chromosomes like a whole recipe book, it's a whole cookbook, but you only want to make one particular recipe out of that for dinner. You don't want to make, say there's 40 recipes in that cookbook. Probably with the genetic code, it's even more than that. But just say there's 40 recipes in that cookbook. You don't need to look at all 40 recipes. You just need the one that you've chosen for dinner. So the markers on our genes are kind of like masking tape, and they mask off all the other recipes that are not needed in that particular area of the body. So that, say, go back to that muscle cell, it can only see the recipes relevant to muscle cells and not anything else. So this is a natural biological function, that we have these markers that are on the DNA and only show the information that a particular area of the body needs, right? Now, you may be saying, okay, well, that makes sense. So what does this have to do with health? So the problem is that the markers sometimes get added in places where they don't belong. So they block off part of a recipe that area of the body needs. So masking tape goes on where it doesn't need, to stay with that analogy, or markers fall off in areas where they shouldn't be falling off. And so recipe is revealed to that area that it really doesn't need. And that can, again, be a problem because it's confusing. And maybe that cell starts to do something that it's not designed to do. So why does that happen? You're probably saying, why are there markers going on in places that they don't belong? Why is there masking tape there? Or why are things coming off in places that they don't belong? So there's lots of different reasons that markers are added or removed from our body where they don't belong. So one of the big factors is exposure to toxins. And this is probably something most of you are somewhat familiar with, that there are a lot of toxins in our environment. The pesticides that can get sprayed on food and have been sprayed on food, especially in the US and North America, for many, many years. And then we bring those into our body when we eat them, because it's very hard to just wash them off with water and maybe soap. And that toxin comes into our body. The air that we breathe, if it has pollution, the water that we breathe, or water that we drink, not that we breathe, can have pollution. And, even when you're drinking filtered water, even when it's processed water, there's things like medications that have either people have flushed them down the toilet, or even just people have taken a medication and naturally eliminated that from their body, and it still stays in the water supply. So it's very, very hard for the water supply to be completely clean. And that's why, home filters and things like that are great, but they're not going to get everything. So some toxins we can be more conscious of and eliminate, and others we can't. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of what that means in terms of your health and some recommendations as this episode goes on. But toxins are one of the things that make markers go on and off in places that they don't belong. And also think about toxins that go on our skin. So especially in the US, I was startled, I don't remember how many years ago, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, when I learned just how underregulated the different personal care products that we use are. The last law was enacted, I think, in either the late 30s or the early 40s, and there were only a very small number, I think 14 or 15 chemicals that are banned from personal care products. And that's the last time laws were made. Well, we have many, many chemicals, and anything that you put on your skin is going to come into your body and create problems. So another thing that creates these marker changes, markers going on and off where they don't belong or where they do belong, is traumas. So if you have had any sort of traumatic experience, and this doesn't have to be, completely the biggest, scariest trauma that you could think of, a lot of times we can minimize things and say it's not really traumatic. It still can affect you. So yes, big traumas, like if you had any abuse in your past, if you were attacked physically or emotionally, death, sudden loss of someone in your life, accidents, things like that, illness. I always say, and I think I have mentioned this in my own story, that receiving a diagnosis was a trauma in my life. And I believe that is the case for many people. But there's also just smaller traumas that we have in our lives, the things that happen in life that leave an emotional impact on us. And this is the case too with both the toxins and the traumas, that whatever happened with our ancestors, this is where sometimes we can start to inherit things. So if your ancestors were exposed to toxins and their body made changes in terms of these markers, that can be passed down. And the same thing in terms of response to trauma. If your ancestor lived through something like a war or a famine or something that was highly traumatic, or even smaller traumas, again, the changes that had then got made in terms of these markers can be passed down from generation to generation. So this is where we start to see more of the impact of our ancestors rather than the actual changes in the DNA. Another factor then that creates these changes in our epigenetics, in the markers and the masking tape, again for the analogy, is just stress. So when we live a very stressful life, and that doesn't have to be crazy big stressors, but when we live with stress on a daily basis, when we don't come out of that fight or flight state, for many of us, we're kind of chronically living in that, or we go into that state many, many times a day. Well, our body responds to all of those stressors, and markers can, again, get added where they don't belong. They can fall off where they do belong, and again, contributing to making us ill. I've already mentioned the ancestral pieces, especially in terms of the toxins and the traumas. And that is another key way that epigenetic changes that contribute to our illnesses occur. And then other things like our lifestyle factors. So what you eat. So if you're somebody that only eats processed food, fast food all of the time, that is certainly going to make changes in terms of these markers in your body. If you're eating more, fruits, vegetables, things in their natural state, that's going to be a benefit. in terms of your health and contributing to the markers staying where they should be. Exercise. So if we've heard that phrase, probably it's popular these days to say, sitting is like the new smoking. I think, that might be a little bit over dramatic to just say it that way. But, if you're not moving your body at all, if you're very sedentary and either sitting at a desk all day, or if you're not feeling well and you're lying in bed a lot, there are important things that happen when we exercise, and different hormones and neurotransmitters and chemicals that get balanced in our body, and stress gets reduced. And again, those particular things can contribute to where markers get added where they shouldn't be, or markers coming off in places that they should be. And another lifestyle factor too is just, some people may be familiar with the importance of vitamin D, and for some you may not really think about this a whole lot. But, vitamin D is an important chemical in our body, and ideally our body is supposed to get it from being exposed to the sun. But for most of us, unless we live kind of in a more tropical part of the world, we're not going to get enough from sun. And so supplementation of that is definitely a key factor, because the body needs vitamin D to do a lot of functions. And if you're not giving it that vitamin D, it can contribute to these epigenetic changes in a way that we don't want. And then a final key area that can contribute to these changes in our markers is our thoughts, what we think on a daily basis. So if you keep thinking, I'm sick, my body is failing me, I'm never going to get better, my life is horrible, all of these things, then that is actually starting to activate different genes in your body than if you were to think, my body is working to heal every day, my body is recovering, I am, growing in health every day. Those thoughts activate different chemicals in the body. And I highly recommend, if this is something that you're curious about, particularly the area of how our thoughts impact our genes and our genetic expression, that you look into both the work of Dr. Bruce Lipton, who wrote something called The Biology of Belief, and that's a great, great book, and also the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, because he talks very much about how our thoughts signal our genes as well. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that kind of in a nutshell, but those are great resources if you're curious about this and you want to dive into especially the power of your thoughts in this area of contributing to your health and well-being, or contributing to illness and staying sick. So I want to share just a little bit of information in terms of what Dr. Bruce Lipton said. And he said that in terms of that idea of cancer, and that there's a cancer program in your genes, yes, that can be true. So I'm going to use the example of the BRCA gene in women with breast cancer. You can go in and test and see if you have this gene that is shown to be linked to breast cancer, and it tends to run in families. But the thing is even if you show up as positive for that, that doesn't necessarily mean that that program has to be turned on, or basically that, the marker, the masking tape that lets that particular cancer program be seen to the cells, it doesn't have to mean that that masking tape isn't covering it up. But, if we get into fear about that, if we're not making good lifestyle choices to support our health of our body and our well-being, then that's more likely for that cancer program to get actively turned on and run. So this is where those beliefs about, and not to place judgment on anyone if they feel like they've had that test done and they've made certain choices as far as wanting to just make sure that they don't get breast cancer. But I would say that it's more likely that the fear, because the test came back positive, is more likely to cause the problem than the actual gene itself. If you really focus on the power of your thoughts and focusing on your lifestyle support factors, that gene doesn't, and that program doesn't necessarily have to be run. So let's talk a little bit more about our thoughts, because I think this is one of the areas that we can really make a lot of impact in terms of our health and well-being by being conscious of this. And then we'll go back a little bit to some recommendations for those other factors in terms of epigenetics and the contributing factors. So how many thoughts do you think that we think on a daily basis? Just what number comes to mind? So much research indicates that it's about 50 to 70,000 thoughts a day. And many of those thoughts are the same ones that we've been thinking for many, many years, usually. We've been thinking them since childhood. And when we think those same thoughts over and over again, that's what starts to signal our genes. So thinking the same thoughts is also connected to different emotions. And so if you think, my life is difficult, I'm sick, I'm never going to get better, what emotion comes up with that? Usually for most people, you'd think maybe frustration, sadness, grief, anger. All of those particular emotions linked to that thought, therefore create different chemistry in the body. So there's different biochemistry of each emotion. And a fascinating book on that topic, if you're really curious about it, is Dr. Candace Pert's Molecules of Emotions. So in that book, she talks about, the biochemistry of each emotion is different. So if you're thinking a certain thought, and again, here we're focused on kind of the negative thoughts and the negative beliefs, and you're creating negative emotions in their body, therefore you're creating a certain biochemistry of those emotions, it kind of becomes like this vicious circle, right? And you can probably think of how that is in your daily life when you get kind of in one of those negative thought spirals, when, something happens to you and you're frustrated or you're angry or you're upset, and then you start to kind of spiral into that. So, somebody upsets you, somebody says something that triggers you, and then you kind of spiral into that, and you keep thinking about other things that upset you, trigger you, frustrate you. And so you're creating more and more and more of those emotions and energy of that negative emotion. And so ultimately, if you're living with a lot of the emotion of anger or frustration and you're constantly kind of activating it, then it shows up in different ways in the body. It affects the body in different ways. And an interesting side note here that comes to mind is the two different emotions that men versus women are more comfortable with. So women tend to be more comfortable with the emotion of fear versus anger. So, and vice versa, men tend to be more comfortable with anger versus fear, just based on kind of cultural conditioning. It's not appropriate for women to kind of get angry and sound off. And for men, they're told they have to be brave and strong, and fear is just not okay. So the fascinating thing then is that many more men get kidney stones, and kidneys are in Chinese medicine connected to the emotion of fear. So it's like there's this crystallization of all this repressed fear energy that then comes up as kidney stones. For women, the opposite is true, where women get gallbladder stones, gallstones, gallbladder attacks, than kidney issues. Not to say that there aren't some of either, but the percentage is usually much higher. And that's like women have that crystallized energy of anger in their gallbladder, because the gallbladder is connected, again, in Chinese medicine, to the emotion of anger. So it's not to say that either of those emotions are bad, but when we don't know how to deal with a particular emotion and we kind of stuff it down and we suppress it, or we say, I'm not going to look at that, I'm not going to deal with it, then it gets held in the body. And I think I've talked a little bit about that in one of the earlier episodes. And that's definitely a topic I'll keep talking about in different ways, because whatever we don't feel in terms of our emotions gets held in the body and manifests as illness. But to come back to this idea of the thoughts that we're thinking and the negative thoughts, again, creating certain emotions in our body, creating certain biochemistry, and then manifesting in certain ways in our body as illness. So when we think about, what we are believing about our health, it's incredibly powerful. So I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics, which is the understanding of placebo research and the power of our minds to heal. Because again, I think this is tremendously powerful and something that you can start to work with on your own on a daily basis to influence and improve your own health and well-being. So first of all, if you're not familiar, what is the placebo? Well, kind of in basic understanding, the placebo is, in a medical research study, when they're trying to test like a drug or a procedure, it's like the sugar pill that people are given. So it's something that's not an active treatment, and yet it's often used to kind of assess against the pill or the surgery or the procedure. And I would add to that definition that it also has to do with how a doctor interacts with you, how they listen, how they engage with you. Is there like even just a gentle touch on your shoulder when they're delivering certain news, eye contact? All of those things actually are part of the placebo effect, because they affect what we believe is possible for us in terms of our health and our healing. So I want to share one of my favorite placebo studies, because I think it's a really fascinating example of this particular topic of the power of our mind and how it influences our health. So this was actually not designed to be a placebo study. It was done by a surgeon who worked on like knee issues and different physical structural issues. So his name was Dr. Bruce Mosley, and he wanted to study which particular type of knee surgery or knee procedure was most effective for his patients. But of course, in order to study something, you always have to have some sort of a control group. So there were 3 groups in this particular study. The first group, they got a procedure where he went in and he flushed out all of the things causing inflammation in the knee joint. So little incisions made in the side of the knee, some saline and other substances kind of flush through the knee to push out things that create inflammation in the knee joint. Second group, he went in and actually kind of shaved down some damaged cartilage in the knee joint to see, because that's another standard treatment for knee issues, is to remove kind of damaged cartilage that might be rubbing and creating problems. And then the third group, they took them in and they put them under anesthesia, and they made those same little incisions like you would get in the other 2 procedures on the side of the knee, but they didn't actually do anything. They just sewed up those little incisions and brought the people back out from under anesthesia. So they were the control group. So the fascinating thing was that the people in this third group who thought they had had surgery but didn't actually have anything done by Dr. Mosley showed just as much improvement, if not maybe even a little bit more in some cases, than the people in the first 2 groups. So all of the people in this study were having difficulty with a variety of physical activities, walking. Some of them used to be able to do things like play basketball, sports, and the people in this control group were able to become physically active again, walk, play basketball. And it was only, I think, a couple of years later that they found out that they hadn't had any surgery at all, that they were just in the control group. And one of the participants actually said, this really illustrates the power of the mind. Like, I didn't know that I didn't have surgery, but I believed that I did and that it was going to help me. And so my body responded in that way. So if you think about that in terms of your own life and your own health, if you believe with your mind and your whole self that something is going to help you, be that a medication, a surgery, or some sort of alternative treatment, and you hold on to that and you really believe it on a deep kind of body-based visceral level, your body will actually respond in that way. It will start to create the healing as if something was given to you. Say, for example, a medication was shown to do something for a particular issue, your body will create actually the same conditions as if you were taking that medication. But again, it's awesome because it's without the side effects. So another example, and it's not quite the placebo effect, but it's about the power of our mind, is an experience that I had about I would say it's 3 years ago now, when I went to the association conference for the Body Talk Association. So one of my teachers and mentors was a speaker, featured speaker at the event, and she asked if I would be willing to be her kind of demonstrator model in this talk she was giving. She was going to, she said, do a session, and would I be willing to be the participant that came up on stage and let her do a session in her talk? And I said, sure. So she gave me some paperwork the night before that was kind of like an intake paperwork, and said to bring it back with me the next day. So she gave her most of her talk and then called me on stage. And as she did, and she brought me up, she took the papers from me, but she didn't really read them. She just divided them in half. And I had noticed when I had filled out the paperwork that it was a little bit of a different intake form. The beginning was much the traditional intake form that you fill out, when you go to any sort of practitioner or doctor. What sort of problem are you having? How is it affecting your life? How intense is it? What is it limiting? All of those kinds of questions. And then the second part of the intake asked some different questions, like, did I believe that healing was possible? And what would I be able to do when this was no longer an issue in my life? Those were the sorts of questions in the second part of the intake. So as I came up on the stage, what she began with was doing some range of motion muscle assessment. So she has a background also as an osteopath. So this is something she traditionally uses a lot in her practice, is kind of doing guided range of motion to see where there's restrictions in the body. So for example, as I laid on a table on my back, on a massage table, she lifted each leg to see where there was resistance and restriction. And she looked at how restricted was my breathing? How did my arms move? How was their rotation in my arms and my legs? So she did that first, and she did just a baseline assessment. And then she asked me to tuck the first half of the intake paperwork into my waistband of my pants. So this was the part that was more traditional, right? Focusing on the problem, focusing on the symptoms. So I did that, and she reassessed. And what do you think happened? What happened was my range of motion decreased from the baseline that she had done just a few moments before. It was very hard for her to lift my legs. My arms were very difficult to move. My breathing became more restricted. And so everyone in the audience could see this. I could feel it in my body as well. And then she asked that I take that paperwork out, and she gave me the other half of the paperwork, the part focused on the potential for healing and how my life would change. So I tucked that in, and she again does the range of motion assessment to see, what changes. So what do you think happened there? My range of motion increased dramatically from the baseline at the beginning. So it was much easier to lift my legs, much easier to move my arms. My breathing improved tremendously. And what I remember was I had walked up on stage, and my low back was very uncomfortable. I had already been sitting for 2 days in uncomfortable chairs in a hotel conference room. So just that action alone had made my body physically uncomfortable. Well, after she did this range of motion assessment with the second set of papers, the pain in my low back basically felt like it was gone. So she hadn't actually done a session on me, a treatment. She just used these two assessment tools with the different focus. And she didn't even read the paperwork. It was just me holding those two different sets of papers on my body, in my energy field, that made this physical change in my body. And for me, it really represented the tremendous impact that what we focus on, what we give our energy to, has on our health and our well-being. So if we're constantly thinking about a problem, if we're constantly thinking about the challenges that we have in our lives and the health problems that we have and how hard it is for us and what it limits, that creates more restriction in our body, that creates more problems and challenges in our body. But if we create the space to hold for possibility and potential for healing, that creates a different response in the body. It was like my body, because of just holding those potentials that I wrote down, because when it asked the question, do you believe your body can heal? I said, yes, absolutely. So just holding that in my body's energy field made a tremendous impact on how my body moved and responded. So just think about when you, on a daily basis, what you're thinking about, what you're believing about your health really has tremendous impact on your body and how it's responding. And personally, I know I don't want to feel pain. I don't want to feel discomfort. I don't want to feel ill. I want to hold space for that possibility and that potential for healing so that my body can therefore respond. Just like in that placebo study, when those participants thought they had had a procedure that would help them, their body followed suit and created that as their reality. Your body can do that too, just by changing your thoughts. And I want to say, in terms of our beliefs and our thoughts, sometimes it's not easy to just do that on your own. So most of our beliefs are subconscious. I think different statistics say, it's only about 5% of our thoughts that are actually on a conscious level. Most of them are unconscious. So it can be hard to access the things that are running in the background, these programs of, believing that things aren't possible, believing you're going to be sick forever, whatever that is for you. So sometimes you need support, and you need practitioners, you need people who can go in and, work with you to help clear these old belief patterns, to clear these subconscious thoughts that are limiting you from getting well. And that's one of the things that I work with clients on, but it's also things that approaches like EFT can help with, hypnotherapy can help with, even a skilled coach can sometimes help you pinpoint the thoughts that you're thinking, because a lot of times, we don't even know what's there way under the surface. It's subconscious and it's been running for so long that when you try to just access it by yourself, you might struggle to really find it. But you can always begin by kind of journaling. What thoughts do you have about your health? What do you tell yourself on a daily basis, on a regular basis, about your potential for health and healing? And are you focusing on how awful the issue is for you, how challenging it is to have this diagnosis, to have this health problem? Or are you allowing there to be space for that potential for healing and transformation? So I want to kind of wrap up today's episode by just thinking about what we've talked about. We've talked about a lot in terms of this field of epigenetics, and what it means is so exciting for our health, because it means we have so much more control over our health and well-being than we used to believe under an old paradigm. So just because you're dealing with a health issue and a diagnosis or whatever it is that you're currently struggling with, it doesn't mean that that is your forever destiny. It means that there are different things that you can start to do to take control of your health and your well-being. So coming back to those things that make changes in terms of our epigenetics, the genetic expression, genes turning on and off, toxins. So try and eliminate the toxins, especially that you can, eliminating them from the things that you eat and trying to eat as cleanly as possible. So trying to eat foods that are organic wherever possible, trying to eat things that don't have chemicals in them because they're processed and shelf stabilized. So things that come out of a package, things that are, frozen often, other than maybe just, fresh vegetables that have been frozen, they all have preservatives in them. And those things can add up and become toxins. Being really conscious about what you're putting on your body in terms of personal care products. So there's different companies out there that are really dedicated to making clean products. One of the ones that I have been a fan of is a company called Beauty Counter. I know Arbonne is also another one that is dedicated to cleaner products. So just researching for yourself and becoming an advocate for yourself of knowing what you're putting on your body, what you're putting into your body. And a great resource to know, what kinds of things are more toxic versus what things are safer and more green. I would suggest looking at the Environmental Working Group. They have a website and they have apps, and you can look at they grade different products based on how safe they are and what the different factor is if they're rated as less safe. Is it due to fragrances? Is it due to a particular chemical in them? So thinking about those things, thinking about how you're cleaning your house too, like what kind of chemicals are you using, and trying to come back to things that aren't, very toxic chemicals, because you're going to be exposed to it when you're cleaning. It's going to stay in your environment. Things that are labeled fragrance, please stay away from those, because fragrance is just a term that can represent a whole host of chemicals. So, candles, cleaning products, things that just say fragrance versus saying what the actual scent comes from, like if it's based out of an essential oil or something like that. It can have tremendous impact because all these things add up. There's certain things in terms of toxins that we can't necessarily control. We can't go around and magically make the air cleaner, unfortunately. We can, do things to advocate for a decrease of pollution, but on a daily basis, we're going to be exposed to certain toxins. But the ones that you can try and minimize and lessen, do that, because it's going to impact your health. It's going to impact your well-being. Traumas. So getting support around clearing old traumas, old difficult experiences that you've had, whether that be you go to therapy, whether that be you work with someone like me, because the work that I do has different techniques that can clear the emotion of traumas. And it does it actually very quickly and very effectively. I've had things that have been traumatic and had 1 or 2 sessions, and the charge of that particular event is gone very quickly. So researching different things that can help you release traumas, because I think, as I've said in one of the early episodes, our body holds on to whatever we don't process. Whatever things we don't deal with, body holds on to it, stores it in our tissue, and you don't want to have all of that affecting you and affecting your health. Stress. So doing different activities to just reduce your stress, to learn how to regulate your nervous system, to get into parasympathetic mode, the rest and digest mode, versus constantly feeling like you're being chased by a wild tiger. So there's many different things out there: meditation, exercise, breathing, yoga, just anything that helps you relax. Try and make that part of your life, because the less stress you have, it's going to improve your health and well-being. It's going to keep these markers where they should be and keep them from falling off or getting added where they shouldn't be. In terms of ancestral things, a lot of the work that I can do, so if your ancestors were exposed to different toxins or they experienced traumas, we can actually clear that through the work that I do. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because it happened before your lifetime and you're inheriting something from an ancestor in terms of their lived experience. There are ways to address it and clear it so it doesn't keep affecting you. And then to come back to those lifestyle factors, make sure that we talked about diet in terms of toxins, but make sure, you're giving your body good nutrients, lots of variety, feed your microbiome, all of those good bacteria in your gut. They need lots of fiber, which is plant material. They need a variety of things. So if you constantly just eat the same couple vegetables over and over, you're not going to have as diverse of a system for your microbiome as if you were to eat a lot of variety of fruits and vegetables. Exercise, move your body. That helps, again, with the stress reduction. It helps with just making sure that all of these complex processes that all of our cells have to do are done properly, and that we're not having these changes in terms of our markers that we don't want. Supplement your vitamin D. Find a good supplement, work with a naturopath or someone else to find a good company that has good, clean products and start using vitamin D. And lastly, spend some time thinking about what you think on a daily basis, especially about your health and well-being. What are you telling yourself? Are you telling yourself you're never going to get better and that this is going to be a problem for forever? Or are you holding space for possibility, for transformation, for healing? And I would highly encourage you to focus on that latter thing, because it can truly transform your life. As that story of one placebo example represents, as the story of me at the conference represents, There's many more studies of placebo. I mentioned a few in my book as well that show just how impactful our thoughts are. As Dr. Joe Dispenza says, our thoughts signal our genes, and they determine which genes get turned on and which genes turn off. And you don't want the genes that create illness and disease to be turned on. So, working with your thoughts and your beliefs is one of the most powerful ways that you can start to change your health and your well-being. So that may seem a little overwhelming when you heard this whole list of different things. And if you're not doing any of these things, I would suggest that you start by picking one or two areas to begin. So, whether that's, I'm going to just focus on my diet and eating a little bit healthier and more cleanly. And, I'm going to try and do a little bit of stress reduction activities. Start with that for a while. And then once you kind of build that into your lifestyle, once you make that kind of a habit and a muscle, add another thing. Because if none of these things are things that you're doing and you're trying to do it all at once, it's going to feel really overwhelming and you're more likely to give up. So just pick one or two things. It can be small, it can be incremental. That's one of the things I like to tell people is don't think that you have to change everything all at once. In fact, that's really a bad idea for pretty much anybody that I've ever encountered, is to try and change everything all at once. So just make it incremental. Baby steps are better. And as you take those baby steps, and it's like you're building a foundation, and you can add things as you feel like, okay, I've got that down. It's not so challenging to think about eating cleaner, and I'm feeling really good with that. Okay, now what else do I want to add on to my routine? All right. Well, I hope that this episode has offered you lots of wisdom and knowledge about this fascinating field of epigenetics and inspired you to realize that your genes are not your destiny. You have far more influence and impact on your health and well-being than you've been led to believe for years and years. And so take control of your health and well-being and do that as in incremental steps. Do that in baby steps, but do take control of your health and well-being, because that is the path to healing. All right, until next time.